Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Room for Discussion.
So the United Nations was founded nearly 80 years ago to protect human rights, facilitate international cooperation, and prevent another world war. Today, the challenges to that mission are arguably the most severe they've ever been. Not only is the geopolitical climate increasingly polarized, but also the international project itself is being called into question by some of the world's mightiest powers.
Joining us to discuss this today is Jan Eliasson, former Deputy Secretary General of the UN and President of the General Assembly. With a lifetime of experience in diplomacy representing both Sweden and the United Nations, he has experienced the difficulties in maintaining a rules-based international order throughout numerous historical changes.
Today, we will discuss the multitude of challenges the UN faces and how it can adapt to try to work effectively in this changing world without losing its core values. I'm Gabe.
And I'm Einar, and we'll be your interviewers for the coming hour. So, without further ado, let's have a big round of applause for Jan Eliasson.
Thank you very much.
So, first of all, good afternoon, Mr. Eliasson, and welcome to Room for Discussion.
Thank you very much.
And we wanted to begin this interview on a more personal note. So, you grew up in a working-class family in Gothenburg, Sweden, being the first one with a university degree. And in your recent autobiography, which we have here, you mentioned that one of the strongest driving forces in your life, you have been thinking, have been the unspoken hopes and expectations of your parents. How do you think this influenced your decision to pursue a career in diplomacy?
Well, it was certainly a driving force. The dreams and aspirations of my parents and their forefathers and foremothers had never been achieved. And they saw finally, when I grew up as a kid, the chance for a new generation in the two families to do other things than they had done in the mines and the Torp Harbor and working class areas. And they put everything into my brother and myself, and they exposed us to, as I said, unintended expectations. They were just so enormously proud of everything we did, and praised us for everything and followed us in detail. My mother kept clippings of my articles about me when I became publicly known in Sweden. And I was glad to see them in the end see me mediate in the Iran-Iraq war under Prime Minister Palme and to be entering the United Nations as UN ambassador. So I remember how enormously proud they were as elders to see that achievement. And all the time, this has been, of course, a driving force for me that to deliver and to try to live up to their expectations.
And you've had an extensive career in diplomacy. And something you have often mentioned is the 4 key skills which you need to succeed as a diplomat in difficult negotiations. And these highlight, for example, personality, cultural sensitivity, and mostly the importance of character. So with this in mind, do you think diplomats are born or made?
I think they're made. I was made. I was certainly not born a diplomat. But I learned from a young age to try to solve problems and to solve them peacefully. And I pretty much mediated also when I was a kid. When there was a brawl threatening, I often tried to find common ground. So there was a certain trait of mine. I was chosen captain of the football team and captain of the handball team and to keep the team together. So I probably had some talent for bringing people together. I learned early in life that the most important word in the world is the word together. It is only when you see the power of collective efforts that you can understand how to solve problems. So I had it in me from the beginning. But what you mentioned in the beginning, the 4 reasons to succeed, was mainly something I developed after my 6 mediations in war and conflict over the years, both in humanitarian crisis and in wars. I identified 4 reasons to solve situations and to achieve results. And the four reasons that we may develop that later on, but the 4 reasons are the word, first of all, because the word is our most important tool. The word is the most important tool in the toolbox of diplomacy. We must collect words. We should have an enormous vocabulary and see the nuances between the words. Secondly, we should analyze timing of efforts. It's very important, never enough analyzed. And the third reason, as you mentioned, is cultural sensitivity, so that you can create trust among the parties. And the fourth reason, which maybe in retrospect is the most important one, is your own personality and personal relations that you develop. But you may want to come back to that later on.
Yeah, that also brings us to the next question, because building on these skills, do you also have a personal example where a misjudgment in tone or approach led to a setback?
Well, I was mediating in the Iran-Iraq war a long time ago, and I was mediating as a representative of the UN with Saddam Hussein in Iraq and with the Iranians in Tehran. So I shuttled between Tehran and Baghdad, and I remember that I in Iran uses the wrong word for a long negotiation we had because I was tired and I wanted to have a break in the talk. So I misjudged the word break up. So I said in the midst of the negotiation, let's break up. And that turned into Farsi by the translator, turned into something like, I leave you forever. I go to the airport, it's over. I will never come back. You know, it's very drastic translation. And the Iranians were extremely frustrated. Why? You came here to negotiate for the UN and you want to finish now because you're tired. I just wanted to have a break, you know, to get some fresh air or have a coffee or something. But then I saved the situation by them asking me rhetorically, if you don't want to negotiate, what do you want to do instead? And then I was sort of leaning back and thinking of 20 visits that I'd made to Tehran. And I had never seen the carpet museum in Tehran, which is the best in the world, one of the most interesting in the world. So I said, well, since you asked me what I want to do, I would like to go to your carpet museum. So instead of making the situations horribly bad, after a while the Iranians thought it was pretty much a gesture of respect for Iranian culture. So they sent me to the museum for 3 hours, and then I came back, and the situation was completely different. I had sort of touched the button of cultural sensitivity, and they appreciated it. So sometimes you can save the situation, but it certainly didn't look well when I said, let's break up.
Yeah, right. And that highlights the importance of your personal skills in diplomacy in your work. Moving forward to what most of your work has been within, which is the United Nations, we wanted to start the conversation off with looking at the theoretical underpinnings of the UN. And as a UN mediator in the Iran-Iraq war, as you mentioned, you began this lifelong commitment to the organizations, and you have often emphasized the importance of returning to its foundational documents for understanding of the basis of the organization, like the Charter and the Declaration of Human Rights, even as we heard, making a habit of carrying the Charter in your pocket. So we were wondering, why is it so crucial to keep revisiting these documents? And do you in fact carry the Charter right now?
Well, I'm embarrassed. I changed my coat before the meeting, and by that I also changed the pants. So I lost it's about 10 yards away, and I don't want to rush away and get it, but it's there. I've had the UN Charter in the pocket since 1980, and I have 12 had 12 different versions after they're worn out. And I've used them extensively, both at the UN and outside the UN, because it's one of the most important documents of international law and international norms. And I would say in today's world, where there is such a loosening of these norms, and I would say also a disrespect of the rules of international law, I think it's more important than ever. And also some very basic issues that come out of the Charter. Many people don't even know what the three first words of the Charter are. I remind them all the time. The first three words of the Charter is "we the peoples." It's not "we the governments." In other words, the authors of the Charter wanted to put the human being in the center. That we have to create peaceful conditions. We have to create good economic and social circumstances. We have to create a respect of human rights and humanitarian law. When I was president of the General Assembly 2005 and 6, I was very proud, together with Kofi Annan, the Secretary General at the time, to develop a formula for the UN, which I still think stands, and we should be reminded of that formula, because it shows the interdependence between the different activities of the UN. And it says simply the following: there is no peace without development, but there is no development without peace. And there will be no peace and no development without respect of human rights. Those are the three pillars of the UN. And if we don't have peaceful conditions, if we don't have social and economic justice, and if we don't have respect of human rights, then we have an unstable society. And in fact, we have an unstable world. So that is what I sort of take out as the most important elements of the UN Charter.
That is really interesting, because it used to be generally accepted in the UN that peace is a precondition for development, but you instead argue that they are mutually reinforcing.
Right. Right.
Exactly.
Actually, I think that theory was something that I was taught in college a long time ago. That first you have peace, then you have development, and then you have human rights. It's completely wrong. I mean, it has to be pursued simultaneously, because they are, exactly what you said, they are mutually reinforcing. And that's the beauty of having a collective effort, as I mentioned in the beginning, the word together, that we pursue the efforts on different fronts to solve the problems. And peace will not be achieved only in military terms. It will be achieved by building also a well-functioning society without corruption and inequities. And of course, most of all, I would say, without disrespect of human rights. So that model, I encourage you very much, you among students, to live by, because you by that will have a much better chance to solve problems. If you ask yourself around this problem, let's say a glass of water, which is a huge problem I worked a lot with, you gather those who can influence the problem. And then you have come out after a discussion of the problem and the identifying the issues. Then you have a division of labor. Then you have a reporting mechanism. Instead, we in the world, and also among governments, I served in government also, we work far too much in silos, and we dig ourselves deeper down. That's wrong. We need to think horizontally of who else can help us solve this problem, and then gather these actors around the table. That's the method that I have, after many years of diplomacy and politics, concluded is the best one.
Yeah. And so you already mentioned approaches to solving problems within the UN, etc. And that leads us well into our next section, which is going into current practical and also more fundamental issues and concerns about the UN. So, staying on the topic of human rights, first of all, the Human Rights Watch recently painted a worrying picture about the state of human rights in the world, with HR violations in Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Sudan, among others. Its executive director has even stated that the whole human rights system is under threat. We were wondering, why is it you think that 80 years of UN interventions haven't been enough to prevent these sorts of crimes from occurring?
Well, I'm astonished myself because I have been living a life of constant improvement of that understanding, the understanding of the virtues of war development, of virtues of peace development and human rights. In fact, my whole life is a voyage from improvement in democracy, improvement in equity, improvement in respect of human rights. I saw the fall of the wall in 1989 in Europe. I was hoping for an East-West period of reconciliation, which never occurred. But it was still a positive trend up until only, I would say, 5, 10 years ago. Something crept into our societies, which I really can't grapple with, but it has to do with the lack of trust. There was a lack of trust for what Russia was doing with their own society, of course, but also in Georgia and later on in Ukraine. There was suspicion among Russians about what NATO expansion would lead to. And China was coming up and felt that the Western powers were jealous of their economic strength growing, whatever it was, but it was distrust growing between the nations, which led to to bring back the UN. It also led to a more copious, more frequent use of the veto. There was no negotiation in the Security Council. When I was in the Deputy Secretary General, I was angry that they didn't bring out a good resolution on Syria, but there was not enough trust among them. And the same thing on Middle East. They were constantly battling, and the veto came up almost automatically. The mistrust was deep. And add to this now, apropos your introduction, add to this also the fact that this mistrust has also entered into our societies. We have had a strengthening of the mistrust factor inside our democracy. We have a polarization of political life in most countries now. And we have a harsh language. And we have forgotten what international law implies. We don't know the Human Rights Declaration of 48 as well as we should. We don't know the humanitarian law. We don't know the Geneva Convention. We don't know the UN Charter. And this is being used by those who don't want to be disturbed in their ambitions to break international law. So we have to have a revival of trust, and we have to have a revival of knowledge. And there you have a very important role as students and as university. And we have to simply start developing diplomacy again. If you look around the world today, it's a horrible lack of diplomacy. They go for military solutions everywhere. And if a war breaks out, it's not only a question of defeating the other side, it's to more or less destroy the nation. Russia, Ukraine, or look at Hamas in the Middle East, but also Israel, vis-a-vis the Palestinians. All over the place, you have diplomacy in second place, or even worse, third or fourth place. And we have to bring back diplomacy as a factor of peace in a more energetic and strong way.
If we zoom in on one case study, one of the worst humanitarian crises today is in Sudan. Since the start of the conflict in 2023, tens of thousands of people have been killed and millions have been displaced. You have worked as a special envoy in Darfur from 2006 to 2008. Looking back at your experiences at the time and how the conflict has developed, what lessons can be learned from Sudan and how can they be used in current diplomatic efforts?
Well, Sudan is a huge tragedy right now. I worked first with Sudan when I was responsible for the humanitarian operations in the UN in the 90s. I was in Sudan during the civil war between the North and South, which later became South Sudan, of course. And then I was chosen as special envoy for Darfur in 2007 and 8. And I tried to end the Darfur war. And we didn't quite succeed, I would say. I would admit we didn't make it. The different forces were pulling in too many directions. But later on, I found that there was such a positive trend because there is something which surprises many in Sudan, even in Khartoum, the government, which is rather authoritarian, run country. But still, the civil society is a strong group in Sudan, both at the capital and the other parts of the country, and also in Darfur. So what developed about 5, 10 years ago was a sort of a strengthening of the civilian part of society, and I saw perhaps one of the rare examples of Sudan going in the direction of civilian rule. After Bashir was deposed as president, a dictator or authoritarian leader. But then what happened was this horrible rivalry between two competing military factions. And one of them, in my view, completely without any legitimacy, the movement led earlier by the Janjaweed, which was a Arab militia, which caused a lot of problems for us and me as mediator in the Darfur crisis. They came in on their camels and their horses and threw dead lamb and dogs in the wells so that people should leave for the huge camps. And these were the leader of that Janjaweed is now the leader of the RSF, which competes for power with the former commander-in-chief of the army. And this has gone on now in an absolutely irresponsible manner. And one thing that I can't understand is why the world allows this to happen, because the Security Council could have stopped this if we hadn't had this horrible distrust that I mentioned. And also, I can't understand why nations continue to arm, particularly the RSF. They get armed from some of the Gulf states. So the wars today are much harder to solve because they become what I call proxy wars. In other words, outside powers play their own games on the land of others, like Syria and like Sudan. So you pointed to a forgotten crisis which should not be forgotten.
Exactly. And I think, do you think that there's what's the most important lesson to be learned from Sudan, if there is any?
Well, my favorite theme is to listen to the vibrations. You should listen to the vibrations. When things start to go wrong, that's when you have to get active. If we could sort of develop a norm or a behavior which starts to act on the indication that there will be a crisis, then we are in a different world. Because once wars start, these horrible wars, I've seen more of wars than I can stand. If wars continue to just break out without any attempt to stopping them, we are coming into a horrible period of life. So I would say, for instance, one should see human rights violations as a sign of a vibration of a sign of war coming. When you torture people from a different ethnic group or people of different political beliefs, a different color of their skin, that's the beginning of tension, which turns easily into violence and civil war and later on international wars. When I was Deputy Secretary General, I tried to bring in the Security Council a program which I call Human Rights Upfront, where we had a system of reporting to the Council human rights violations and giving them a chance to act, sending representatives, taking political moves and so forth to stop a war from erupting. But that activity has stopped. It's not going on anymore. It was not very popular for the Security Council to listen to the complaints of the Secretariat about human rights violations in different countries. So I really encourage you as students to take on this sort of broader approach to peace and bring in the different elements that I come back to earlier. Combine peace efforts with development efforts and human rights efforts. That's the best peace plan you can develop, both locally and globally.
So development is maybe the main lesson. And I think you mentioned something else that's very crucial there, which is this enforcement issue on nation states when human rights violations occur. And I think one of the United Nations' original intentions, of course, was to prevent these atrocities. Yet, as they still happen, it brings up the question that at the core of international law and by extension the UN, is this attempt to balance human rights with respect for national sovereignty. So I think this begs the question, as these things clash, is this paradox the fundamental reason that such atrocities do continue?
Well, I want to tell you about something interesting that occurred 2005, or rather before that, because there was a need after what had happened in Cambodia and Rwanda and Srebrenica to stop genocide or crimes against humanity, serious violations of human rights, to stop them inside nations. And it was resisted by many nations as interference in internal affairs, sovereignty, as you mentioned, Einar. But then there was a report that was developed by mainly the Canadian and Australian foreign ministers. And they came up with the notion, which was picked up in that summit document 2005. I was present, so I was very proud of putting in that document 2005. It is called Responsibility to Protect, R2P. Look it up. R2P means that you have a responsibility to protect your own population from genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, all the things that the ICC, International Criminal Court, now are engaged with. And by that, we turn this around. We ask the governments, is it not in your own power, and isn't it your obligation to protect your population from genocide?
Yeah.
And they couldn't answer no. It was a very good diplomatic move. If you couldn't say no to that. And from then on, we can always turn to nations and say, you are now breaching the principle of the responsibility to protect. You are not protecting your population. This doesn't mean that we easily can get inside a nation, particularly if it were to include military means. But we certainly have legitimacy to make the point that you are mass killing people. And we have done so and made life miserable for those who do so. And they know what the ICC can do. And look at the Middle East, how both sides fear that they will have to turn up at the ICC or at even the International Court of Justice. In your own country, Netherlands has great traditions, by the way. I must commend you for what you have done for international law, the Dutch. Thank you.
Yeah. You've already mentioned the issue of veto power, and we'd like to elaborate on that because it is often the veto power is often a paralyzing structure, and it leads to the Security Council's permanent members vetoing a lot of these resolutions. You have said that the conflict in Israel-Palestine is one of the clearest examples of this structural freeze. So how is this phenomenon limiting the scope of the UN's impact in these conflicts where it is needed the most?
I happen to have met some people when I was a young diplomat who were present in San Francisco, 1945, when the UN Charter was born. And one of them told me that the heaviest moment for the authors of the Charter was to include the veto power in the Charter, because they felt that this was against the principle of the equality of nations and equality of man, basically. But they did so because one of the lessons of the League of Nations was that the big powers did not take the League of Nations seriously because they had no special privilege. Now they were given this special privilege. In other words, I wouldn't say privilege, it's a responsibility to maintain objectively international peace and security. And I think to a great degree they have failed. And particularly during the last 5, 10 years, because the UN has been suffering a bad reputation because of non-action in Ukraine and in the Middle East and Syria and so forth. So therefore, I think their biggest failure is that they have not sufficiently mediated and negotiated in the Council. During the Cold War, there was sort of the Soviet bloc versus the West, and the vetoes were, used massively, both by the East and both by the Russians and Chinese and by the U.S. and U.K. U.S. and U.K. were throwing vetoes on South Africa and apartheid. Could you believe it? And on the Middle East, of course, and always
Yeah.
almost automatically. So when the Cold War ended, or at least should have ended, 1989, that was the most optimistic period, the best period that I have experienced in the UN. I saw the Russian and American ambassadors sit down and do negotiations. And there was no tension between G77, the developing countries, and the Western powers. It was the best period that I can recall in the UN. And they negotiated resolutions on the Balkans, for instance, and other issues. But now they are back in that business again of vetoing almost automatically or threatening of a veto, which has the same effect. I think they are not exercising their diplomatic responsibility because they should negotiate. And we could have easily found a formula on Syria earlier when I was a deputy secretary. No, but they didn't do it. And they refused to take in the human rights factor. And now Sudan, as you mentioned, Gabe, is the perfect example of non-action. Where is the national interest of Russia, US, and China in Sudan? If you don't have a national interest, then you should, of course, develop a formula to save the country and the people of Sudan. They don't do that. Jokingly, Einar probably has heard me say this before because I tell that story in Sweden pretty often. I had lunch with the 5 permanent members after I retired as President of the General Assembly, 2006. And they asked me about my assessment of the Security Council. And I said almost the same thing I said to you now, maybe a little bit more mildly. Still, they sort of got the point. And in order to strengthen my point, I said to them, you're not negotiating enough. You should, and then I said, I give you an example. You should work like the Catholic Church when they select popes. You should lock yourself into a room, sit down there and negotiate until you have a consensus resolution. Then you come out with the strong respect of the Security Council, and the Security Council resolutions, in contrast to the General Assembly resolutions, are binding. Security Council binding, General Assembly only recommendation. In other words,
Yeah.
you should simply let out the white smoke from the Sistine Chapel when you're ready. Then you are allowed out. I don't think all of them appreciated my joke, but it was seriously meant.
Yeah, because this also ties into another common criticism of the Security Council, which is that there is no representation or a lack of representation from the global south. So no African nation is a permanent member, and India often voices its discontent over being left out despite being the world's most populous nation. So if the UN is perceived to be biased against the global south, how can we expect emerging nations to trust it? And how can we change the UN structure to accommodate their distrust?
It's a very good question, and I'm sorry that it has been so difficult to move on that issue. The veto powers have always stopped these reform efforts. And you're right, the most obvious deficiencies is the fact that Africa is not represented on the Security Council. Latin America is not represented on the Security Council. India, with this huge population, is not on the Security Council. So that has also been strengthened, I can speak to you very openly, recently by the fact that the West, by many countries in the South, have been criticized for having double standards. That we have been very firm on territorial integrity and sovereignty and norms of international law and humanitarian law on Ukraine. But in the Israel Arab or Israel Palestinian crisis, there has been a much weaker response from the West. And there has been deep criticism from the developing countries that we have different standards. And that is correct. I mean, there is all the reason to look into breaches of international law, both by the Hamas, Hezbollah side and Iran, but also by Israel. And we can't hide that. And that has hurt the Western credibility. And I would even say that it could also hurt the support of Ukraine if we show that double standard so clearly as been the case earlier. Principles cannot be relative. You know, if you have a principle, you have to stick to it. And that's why I carry the charter to remind us when we start to glide on that. It's going to be a very big test, both to end the Ukraine war and to end the, if possible at all, the Middle East crisis without breaching or without really taking up the serious violations of international law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned sticking to these principles in the real world. So we wanted to now move on from having established criticisms of the workings of the UN to how we can move into the future. And you have said that the so-called liberal international order has been working effectively previously, but is now under serious strain. Of course, as we know, Russia is leading an offensive war against Ukraine. China is increasingly threatening Taiwan, and most recently, the US has effectively ceded its role as the guarantor of all of its allies. So, with all this in mind, can the United Nations adapt to these changes, do you think, without losing these core values of maintaining a rule-based international order?
Well, that's a big question. In a way, I don't envy you, the next generation, who will develop the new diplomacy needed in today's world. But it's now almost changing by the day, by the week, and in a negative direction. What I fear most of all is that we leave the international law aside and leave the international organizations weak, UN, European Union, and so forth, not given a chance or not taking a chance to strengthen themselves, and instead leaving room for proxy wars for the big powers to play their games on third country territory, and even claiming foreign territory. Russia is claiming actually Ukraine, and the US is claiming Panama and Greenland and Canada, whatever. And you have China's interest in Taiwan. And if they, with the power of might and strength, military might, which grows by the week also, exercise that power, and the international reaction is too weak. We have too few powerful actors on the scene who defend this small and medium-sized nation's interests. Then we are in a very dangerous world. For Europe, of course, as you sit now in the heart of Europe and in an original European Union country, I would say that this is the hour of truth for European Union and NATO. NATO could then be NATO, the European NATO countries, plus Canada. And that this is a historic chance to stand up for strengthened security in Europe as a reaction to the Russian aggression, supported sadly and tragically by the present president of the United States. I doubt that it is by the American people. But it's just horrifying to see this trend of support of United States to Putin's aggression without qualifications, as it seems. It grows by the day, this support. And that means that if Europe doesn't react and doesn't stand up for its own security, does what it can to compensate for the loss of both support to Ukraine and loss of perhaps the trust in Article 5 of the UN of the NATO Charter, although that hasn't been publicly stated yet, but the actions from Washington point in that direction. In that case, we are in a hurry to strengthen that European capacity, not only for security, but also, and this is deep, for democracy. Because who will in the world be the global actor for democracy if you have Putin in Russia and his friends and his group and without the democratic tradition in Russia, and if China, of course, fully a totalitarian state, and the United States, very questionable on very basic democratic issues, apart from disappointing us on security. Well, it must be Europe.
Yeah.
So Europe has a role both for security and for democracy. And that's a task that all of you in this room should think about. You have a role. You have an important role now to run with that baton and develop a new energetic diplomacy for Europe.
Yeah, and recent events can be quite worrying. For example, just a few weeks ago, an investigation was launched by Republican lawyers on the feasibility of withdrawing the United States from the United Nations entirely. And as daunting as this might sound, this is not the first time an attempt at international cooperation has been seriously obstructed by the absence of cooperation from the United States. It reminds us of the interwar period and the League of Nations. So how can the United Nations avoid the fate of the League of Nations?
Well, that's a good question. I was Deputy Secretary General when Trump came into power the first time, and I saw how he quickly left the Paris Agreement on climate, and he left the Human Rights Council that I had been part of creation, actually, back in 2006. He left several UN organs, and now the same thing happens again. He has left. Trump has already more left the Paris Agreement. He has also left the World Health Organization, and he has left the Human Rights Council. And I don't know whether he will continue on that path. And the statements made about the United Nations and the vote by the US on the Ukraine resolution 2 weeks ago was incredible. They voted with North Korea and Belarus and a few other totalitarian states with Russia on Ukraine. So there are unbelievable things happening. On the other hand, there is something around Trump which is completely difficult to foresee. The unpredictability is part of his style and his shocking and constantly new ideas and new approaches is probably intentional to create an almost hysteric pace of diplomacy. So I hope we have the nerve to stay cool and collected and stick to principles and stick to a direction that we decide upon. Because we will have to defend these organizations much more in a more determined way. I have done my thing to try to defend the UN, even if I see the weaknesses of the UN. But we also have to stand up and very proudly defend the European Union. What you did, the Dutch, to enter that organization was not about coal and steel back in the late 40s, early 50s. It was to stop war between Germany and France that had affected you in a tragic way so much, and other nations also. It was a peace project. So we have to restore that belief in us as Europeans. I am critical of my own government. We didn't want to strengthen, make Europe federal structure. We were worried that Brussels would take too much power. But I have shifted opinion now. Not that I'm still a full federalist, but I certainly think that we need to have stronger European institutions. We need to have a stronger defense, but we need also have stronger resilience in our societies. We have to have well-functioning democracies so that the extremist political movements that grow in Europe will not be given encouragement. We have to be tough with ourselves also to make our societies better. We can't stand up for democracy in the world unless we should be proud of our own countries, their institutions, what we do. We need to have that model in our mind here also now: peace, economic and social justice, and human rights. So it's a challenge. I would even say go as far as trying to get something positive out of a horrible situation. I would say if we accept to see the European strengthening of Europe as our project, then there is even a hopeful element of this threat of the major powers playing games at the cost of the small and medium-sized nations. We have got used for so long to have the American guarantee, and we should be grateful for that. I have lived in the States for 16 years. I went to school in America. I was there in the embassy. I was ambassador in Washington. I have loved this nation, and I hope that they are back on track at some stage. But now we have to start to understand that it's much better if we start now to strengthen our own security and strengthen our democracy.
I think that's a nice note to take a small break in our conversation and open up the floor to questions from the audience. And so in order for Mr. Eliasson to be able to see your audience questions, we kindly ask you to step up to in front of the stage here.
The audience is still there. That's a good sign.
The audience is still here, yes. Even more of them.
Good.
So if you have any questions, just yes?
Is of the double standard that you mentioned. Is it just pure racism and discrimination?
No, I don't think it's racism.
1 second. There were some technical issues with the microphone.
Racism, is it economic interests? And also, how can we overcome this double standard? Like, are the means currently being pursued, like the hate group and the ICC arrest warrant, is that enough to overcome the double standard, or is there more that we need to do?
No, as I said, I hope that it has no element of racism in it. But I understand why suspicions grow in that direction. I think it's in the case of Israel, it's the enormously tight relationship between the United States and Israel that is obvious in both Middle East history and US history. And to change that is extremely difficult. Everything that is considered against Israel's interest is vetoed by the US. And unfortunately, the European Union has been not too solid on Middle East. And that's why I think we should develop much stricter respect for the international law. We can't have this double standard. And particularly European Union, in our own neighborhood, the whole Middle East, we gain from standing firm on being firm on Israel. I mean, the reaction of Israel is understandable on the 7th of October events, but my God, look at the ruins, look at what is left of that country, and look at the number of deaths and children and women. It's just completely against the proportionality principle of international law. And that cannot be denied. And using starvation as a method of warfare is medieval. And also moving populations into other areas is just also a breach of international law. This doesn't prevent me from taking enormously strong distance to the violence and the use of violence against civilians that took place on the 7th of October and so forth. But you have to have cool nerves. And I remember in the UN when you took these positions, it took a bit of a tough time to stand up to principle. But I hope to God it doesn't enter the area of racism. There, I must say, I'm more fearful of the domestic forces in Europe, that some of those parties on the far right have elements of racism that could very much damage the efforts of Europe. The parties of that extreme right are not only not accepting migration and refugees to a degree that at least I and many of you hopefully do, but they are also against the strengthening of European institutions. The extreme right parties don't want to have the strength in Brussels or Strasbourg. And I can't see how we can gain anything for Europe by having weakening of European institutions now, when the great powers are behaving the way they do.
All right, I think we have time for another audience question. This gentleman in the jacket.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a question on the United States possibly withdrawing from the UN Charter and also stepping out of NATO. So suppose the United States does that. Do you think the United Nations will still be effective as a consequence, given that the United States has historically been one of the driving actors beyond the United Nations and NATO? Furthermore, say we get a more internationalist administration, hopefully, after the Trump administration. Do you think it will take a very long time to, just to sort of restore some of the damage, or will it actually be a lot less grievous than we might imagine?
Well, I have a personal prediction, and it's risky to make a personal prediction, but I don't think they will go as far as leaving United Nations and leaving the UN Charter. I think they will stick to, and that's serious enough, leaving the special organs that exist, that I just mentioned. But to leave the United Nations, which was established in San Francisco in 1945, is something that I don't think they will do, and I don't think they need to do it. They can conduct their intentions anyway. The same thing goes actually for NATO, leaving NATO as an organization. As I said earlier, they have not yet admitted that Article 5 is not valid. Trump has said that those who don't pay more than or less than 2% of the GMP will not have the support of the US. He could leave it to Putin to take care of that, he said once, which is, of course, very, very bad for credibility of Article 5. But they haven't publicly said anything else my government keeps saying that we are receiving assurances that Article 5, the mutual guarantees, still exist for the Trump administration. But then there is something else which will prevent Trump from leaving NATO completely. Last fall, I think it was maybe last spring, the Senate passed a resolution of NATO membership, which means that in order to leave the United Nations, I think there's a need for, if I'm not wrong, 2/3 majority in the Senate. And the Democrats are strong enough to stop that, I believe. Plus the fact that even if the Republican Party now is completely obedient to Trump, 7 to 10 senators are completely committed, basically in their hearts at least, to NATO. So I don't think they will take that extreme step. But I may be wrong, and you may recall that I was wrong when they do so. I hope I can survive my reputation.
Okay, I think we have time for one more audience question. Is there still someone? Yes, this gentleman in front here.
Okay. I want to ask a question about internal politics of America. You said a few months away that Europe has to step up to give a strong reaction to the politics of the states. But how is it in the states itself? I mean, is there any sign or a perspective that people step up against the policies of Trump? And you can see it, of course, on the political level or the civilian level. But do you see any sort of sign that which could become stronger in time to come?
Well, for the time being, I have the feeling that the Democratic Party more or less is in a sort of political shock. I have waited for strong responses from major personalities in the Democratic Party, but it's been rather silent. The only one who really speaks out strongly is Bernie Sanders, and he's far to the left, the Democratic Party and the American political scene. So I think it's hopefully a time factor. This enormous shock of shocking news from Washington has sort of stunned political life. The second part is that we must understand, I've lived in America. I went to school in Indiana, right in the middle of the US. The liberal tendencies exist in the East Coast and West Coast, but practically everything in between, particularly on the countryside, is Trump country. And in a strange way, he has spoken to the forgotten people and people who feel betrayed and who don't see any economic change. On the contrary, if you take a car drive up even to upstate New York, it looks like ghost towns all over. In Pennsylvania too, when I was in the UN and took trips, So he has picked up on the fact that even a strong democracy has not done well enough to keep the nation together. And he has picked up on that. After all, getting 50% of the vote to crazy policies of Trump's is otherwise completely impossible to understand. But what I think could change is if, as you see today, and now a couple of days ago, and it will continue, if you see the markets tumble, if you see the stock prices going down, if people are losing their savings, then he is very vulnerable. He doesn't seem to understand that if he puts in a 25% tariff, that leads to higher prices. He may believe that the production goes to the United States instead, but that is a rare case. So I think if people see that what he has promised will not hold water economically and socially, then I think his support will be reduced. On the other hand, he may do something soon which is a mixed blessing. He may push the Ukrainians so far that they have to accept an unjust peace. I hope to God they don't. I have mediated in 6 wars and 6 conflicts. I have actively helped the weaker parties sometimes to sustain agreements that are fair and just. Because an unjust agreement where you lose your sovereignty and your dignity, then you will have another conflict, even war, coming up. So what I fear is that he may push Ukraine so far that there is an unjust peace. Maybe this new meeting that starts today in Saudi Arabia with Rubio and the National Security Advisor, maybe they will then try to bring in some requests also on Russia, particularly on security guarantees, and to accept sovereignty and freedom and democracy in Ukraine. If that is acceptable to Ukraine, to Zelensky and his government and Ukrainian people, who has been fighting this heroically, this war, then I think we must accept that, even if international law will probably be compromised. International law will probably be compromised on the territorial integrity, because US has already assured Russia that Ukraine should not have their territory back, all of it. So therefore, you have to, in my view, as a diplomat, find a method that don't make the agreement on borders permanent, but you make that sort of temporary. You wouldn't believe it, but that is actually the case of South and North Korea. They are still in an armistice, so it hasn't been recognized. You should still have the possibility of reuniting Korea. Sounds a bit theoretical, but I'm saying that you have to think of that. When I was mediating between Iran and Iraq, I was really pressed by both parties to accept that a part of the other country was part of the other when they had the military superiority. I and my predecessor, Olof Palme, never accepted that. We said no. A peace agreement must be based on the principle of recognition of international borders, as agreed earlier. But anyway, no, my point is simply this. I don't believe we need to hopefully worry about leaving UN and NATO completely. So but we have, it's enough of a problem what we already have.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for your answers to those audience questions, and thank you very much for your great audience questions. So as we are slowly having to wrap up this interview, we wanted to get an insight into your more personal thoughts on the future. And you have always persistent throughout your life called yourself an optimist. Now recently you started calling yourself a worried optimist. But we were curious, despite everything we've talked about throughout this interview, what is it that still makes you call yourself an optimist, although a worried one?
Well, you caught me there, because for a long time I have called myself a worried optimist. But more recently, pressed on this exact question, I have had to admit that I, in certain cases, am a pessimist who has not given up. It is a situation which is so serious now that we must make a clear analysis with warts and all, and not make a rosy picture of the situation. I think we need a very sober and clear analysis without too many hope factors included. But my UN background forces me also in a positive way to always not only reflect the world as it is, but we must always also see the world as it should be. So you need to have 2 glasses on, one that sees the world as it is, and another set of glasses where you see the world as it should be. That's why I carry the UN Charter in the pocket. And I see the role of the UN still the role above all of the European Union and NATO, Western Europe now. I see that their role is to remind us of the world as it should be. And that our job is our job daily is to reduce the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. A millimeter, a centimeter, half a meter. We can do it everything. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And if we fall into hopelessness and pessimism, the full pessimism, then we are lost. So I would hope to be back on being a worried optimist if you prove to me that the next generation is taking on the responsibility and that you run with the baton in this race that we have ahead of us, which is more serious than I can recall in my diplomatic life.
I believe that is a good note to end upon. Thank you so much, Mr. Eliasson, for joining us today.
Thank you.
If you
and
can't
good
get
luck.
enough,
Hmm?
yes, and to the audience, if you can't get enough of room for discussion and want to continue the discussion on human rights in a world with sovereign nation states, we are interviewing Kenneth Roth, former executive of Human Rights Watch, here on the stage at 1 to 2 on the 17th of March.
And on the 24th of March, also between 1 and 2, and also here on the stage, we will be interviewing Dr. Jisung Park, an environmental and labor economist at the University of Pennsylvania, to talk about the interplay between environmental factors and economic opportunities.
Last but not least, if you yourself want to sit on these couches and interview, don't forget to send in your applications to join the committee. Applications close on the 16th of March at midnight.
But for now, thank you once again for joining us at Room for Discussion, and please join us in giving a final warm applause to Mr. Eliasson.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you and listening listening to you. Good questions, both from you and the audience. I thank you very much. I have proved to the audience that diplomacy doesn't have to be uncertainty, but I would say diplomacy should be clarity based on values and principles. That's what we have to stand for.
Yeah.
Not evading issues that sometimes we think in terms of diplomacy. So I hope that I've expressed myself with clarity. Thank you very much.
You have.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.